The Star Wars Rogue Squadron games released originally on Nintendo 64 and GameCube respectively between the years of 1998 and 2003. It was a flight combat series made in a collaboration between Factor 5 and LucasArts that was met with praise from critics and relative success. In the years that followed its last installment, Rebel Strike, rumours of a follow-up continue to occasionally crop up. There were stories of an apparent sequel and a possible remastered collection, but none of these amounted to anything. It wasn't until October 2014 that the former president of Factor 5, Julian Egbrecht, appeared on IGN's Nintendo podcast to shed some light on what happened. He revealed a scrapped multiplayer version of Star Wars Rogue Squadron and an unreleased compilation of the games with new features. The true extent of the developers' involvement with Star Wars and their relationship with LucasArts, however, was far from fully divulged. In looking back through the rich history of these two companies, we will learn more about the missing trilogy collection and discover two more lost Star Wars games that have never previously been spoken of publicly. In around October 2003, Star Wars Rogue Squadron 3 Rebel Strike was finished and launched in all territories by the end of November. During that game's development, Factor 5 had begun to take on other projects on the side, such as proposals for Nintendo. This included a gritty take on Pilot Wings for the GameCube, which was set during the early Cold War era. This was a time in the company's history when they were relentless in coming up with new ideas as they were trying to decide what was next. At some point during the making of Rogue Squadron 2, they had done something they'd never previously done with Star Wars. After a few years of making games where you played as members of the Rebel Alliance like Luke Skywalker, their creative heads decided to do things a bit differently. Hidden inside the game were two non-canonical bonus missions named Triumph of the Empire and Revenge on Yavin respectively. They imagined an alternative timeline to Star Wars in which the Rebel Alliance is crushed by the Galactic Empire. It was a short what-if story which asked, what if the Rebels failed to destroy the first Death Star in the climax of A New Hope? The player controlled Darth Vader, piloting his distinctive TIE Advance X-1, who must put a stop to the Rebel assault on the Death Star. If successful, Luke Skywalker is killed moments before completing his attack, and the Empire emerges triumphant. In the following mission, Vader and his squadron invade Yavin 4. They must eliminate all of their fleeing transport vessels to prevent the Rebel leaders from escaping. A couple of years on from Rogue Squadron 2, Factor 5's people decided they would revisit this concept after Rebel Strike. They would take the idea much further in a spin-off of the Rogue Squadron series dubbed Star Wars Dark Squadron. As the name suggests, this was planned to be an entire game where the player fought for the Imperials, joining their campaign to quash the Rebel Alliance. Like Rogue Squadron, it would have been a flight combat game, but with a spotlight on Imperial ships like TIEs as you would expect. The main playable character would have been Darth Vader, as it was in the aforementioned Empire levels from Rogue Squadron 2. The previous games offered players some limited strategy elements, such as the ability to issue orders to your squad mates with the D-pad.
Engage at will.
Dark Squadron would have expanded upon this, allowing you to command an entire Imperial fleet. You would have been able to bring up a menu during missions to purchase new support options. This entailed everything from tactical moves like orbital strikes and blockades to summoning new Star Destroyers, bombers, and walkers for ground assaults. A former programmer of Factor 5 suggested the game would have seen a number of enhancements over Rebel Strike, saying that it was to have a renewed focus on vehicle missions. Rebel Strike was the first edition of the Rogue Squadron series to feature on-foot sections with shooting gameplay inspired by the classic arcade game Robotron 2084. By the company's own admission, these segments hadn't turned out quite as well as they had hoped, drawing criticism from critics and fans alike. Had it been made, this new project would have done away with those sections completely. Dark Squadron was in essence a pitch that was floating around for a possible game. There was no gameplay prototype ever made, just one or two pieces of concept art, early animatics, and documentation showcasing some of the team's ideas. It was conceived after the end of development on Rebel Strike, and like that game, they wanted it to be a GameCube exclusive. The material for Dark Squadron was coming together towards the end of 2003, as LucasArts was preparing to deliberate over their budget for the following year. This was the time when the publisher would review pitches from their partners and decide which games would be receiving funding. LucasArts, of course, wasn't just a publisher, it had its own in-house development team that was making its own original projects, like various tie-ins to the Star Wars prequel movies. series. They were also contributing towards various productions being handled externally, including the Rogue Squadron games. Around the time that Dark Squadron was being realised, they too were trying to get a new project funded. Despite the LucasArts development team being part of the larger company, they weren't supposed to have any kind of advantage over third-party companies like Factor 5 when it came to the pitching process. They were still required to pass all of the same hurdles as anyone else trying to get a game funded. They had to present it to a LucasArts publishing committee comprised of their higher-ups. The LucasArts team had come up with the concept of doing an action-adventure game with popular Star Wars character Chewbacca as the lead character. It would have explored that space of Chewie's life when he went from being a warrior on Kashyyyk to being Han Solo's right-hand man. Their ideas revolved around his adventures working as a bounty hunter between the years of episodes 3 and 4. This Chewbacca bounty hunter game was set to compete directly with Dark Squadron for funding. Due to the constraints of the yearly budget, it was unlikely that both would be picked up. If one was approved, the other would have to be shelved. Unfortunately for Factor 5, it was the Chewbacca project that would emerge the victor, while Star Wars Dark Squadron was rejected. Reportedly, there was some trepidation around proprietary issues, as well as how well Factor 5 would be able to implement some of their ideas, and how the player would perceive them in the game. Although, some former associates of the two companies blamed the outcome at least partially on politics inside LucasArts. The creative head of the Chewbacca game was Hayden Blackman, who was the project lead on the MMO Star Wars Galaxies. It's claimed by some that Blackman may have used his influence inside the company to sway the greenlighting committee and help push Dark Squadron aside to further his project. Factor 5 meanwhile was quick to recover from their loss, having a new proposal lined up, and this time with the full backing of LucasArts. They now sought to produce a remastered compilation of the Rogue Squadron games with new features and some major improvements. During the development of Rebel Strike, Factor 5 had come under increasing pressure from LucasArts to abandon their pact of exclusivity with Nintendo. Rogue Squadron 2 and 3 were both GameCube exclusives, despite the console struggling to sell nearly as well as Nintendo had hoped. While Rogue Leader performed well at the launch of the system, its sequel wasn't anywhere near as successful. LucasArts wanted Factor 5 to start developing for a console with a larger share of the market that was powerful enough to run their games, the Xbox. After some reluctance, Factor 5 finally agreed in late 2003 that they would begin developing for the Xbox, starting with the Rogue Squadron collection. This would appease LucasArts from a business perspective, but to Factor 5 it also meant they could embrace the new opportunities which came with the platform. It allowed them to explore a frontier they had been unable to on GameCube, which was online play. All of the versus modes that were previously only available through local split screen were now to be redone to support play over Xbox Live. Work on the Xbox conversion of Rogue Squadron progressed without incident until April 2004, when the foundations of LucasArts were rocked by management shifts. The company's board appointed their vice president of marketing, Jim Ward, as their new president. Ward had inherited the duty of turning the declining publisher around. At the time, they were in such bad financial shape that employee bonuses for 2004 had to be dropped completely. Their new president wasted little time in asserting himself. Within the first months under Ward's leadership, LucasArts cut numerous projects benefiting from their funding, and before long, the Rogue Squadron trilogy found itself in the firing line. Despite the fact that it was around halfway done and was on schedule for a late 2004 release, the project was canned in an unexpected turn for the developers. Most of the work done was on porting the offline missions into one merged interface. The online components were never up and running. In a twist of irony, the Chewbacca game, which inadvertently led Factor 5 towards making the Rogue Squadron collection project, was never made either. Although it did pass the initial pitching process and was greenlit, it was later shot down by George Lucas himself. Lucas apparently didn't appreciate some of their ideas, like the thought of Chewbacca leading his own game. Instead, the team ended up working on a new game which would eventually become Star Wars The Force Unleashed. For a while, Factor 5's Rogue Squadron collection would remain shelved. It wasn't until over 3 years later that it would eventually resurface. In late 2007, production on Lair, Factor 5's poorly reviewed PlayStation 3 exclusive, was wrapping up. It was then that the company entered one of the most experimental parts of its history. Pitches for new original games were being formulated left and right. It was in this bubble of possibility that Rogue Squadron would return. They planned to resurrect the half-finished remastered trilogy with a wealth of new features under the codename of Green Harvest. Their platform of choice to develop it on was the Wii. This was due to their friendly relationship with Nintendo and extensive knowledge of the hardware from having a hand in designing the GameCube years earlier. Their ideas of how to use its unique features to give it broader appeal were how they were able to sell LucasArts on reviving it. They would build a selection of new multiplayer modes, including most crucially a lightsaber game which would use the Wii's upcoming Motion Plus peripheral for optimum accuracy. It would be a lightsaber duel mode where players would slash one another to the death, complete with character-specific force powers like lightning. As it turned out, Factor 5 became one of the first developers outside of Nintendo to receive early prototypes for the Motion Plus accessory. This allowed them plenty of time to implement it. The lightsaber battle mode was fairly robust, featuring 20 playable characters and the ability to add comically large Mii heads to them. The character roster was made up of Emperor Palpatine, Darth Maul, Darth Vader, Obi-Wan, Yoda, and a handful of variants upon Princess Leia and Luke Skywalker. This included their various appearances from the movies like Luke's Stormtrooper disguise and Leia's infamous slave costume. The mode was playable in a variety of iconic settings, including the Death Star hangar and the Cloud City carbon freezing chamber. Each had its own environmental hazards, including crates that could be hurled using the Force and death pits that players could be knocked down. Alongside the lightsaber dueling was a new speeder bike race mode inspired by the forest chase sequence from Return of the Jedi. Players could compete with one another across a selection of planets, such as Tatooine or Endor. The Wii compilation scrapped the concept of online play that its Xbox Forerunner once touted as a core feature. Instead, the developers chose to invest their time in adding new modes and creating a local multiplayer section with plenty of content. In addition to the multiple versus game types, there was an entire cooperative campaign too. It all sported new support for widescreen and ran at 60 frames per second using Factor 5's in-house Wii engine. The structural setup of the main story missions was a bit different from the original games. As opposed to playing through a fixed campaign and unlocking them one after the other in a linear order, you would collect credits from each level and would then be able to choose whichever stage you wanted to play next. The collection included every ship that had previously been in the series, as well as one new addition, an AT-PT for the Walker missions. As for the controls, the game offered a wide selection of options. There was support for classic controllers, GameCube controllers, the Wii Remote held horizontally, the Wii Remote and nunchuck combo, or the Wii Remote positioned vertically controlling the ship with the infrared pointer. Players could even add a Wii bounce board to one of these, manipulating the acceleration by applying pressure to the left and right of it with their feet. The Wii Trilogy collection was a somewhat more accessible take on Rogue Squadron that aimed to remedy a lot of the issues audiences had with past releases. Namely, they had overhauled the on-foot sections from Rebel Strike, retooling the aiming mechanics to make them much less automated, and introducing cover shoot elements. The project ran smoothly for over a year until December 2008 when the studio faced bankruptcy. They had also been working on an open-world Superman game for Brash Entertainment, who had went under in November. Factor 5 had opted to pay for development themselves in the hope that a new publisher would pick it up. Due to the toxic financial climate at the time, no new publishing partner was found, Factor 5's monetary resources were drained, and they too were forced to shut down. Some reports claim that this was the end of the Rogue Squadron Wii project, that it was at this stage completed and mysteriously never released. The truth is a bit more complicated than that. On December 19th, 2008, Factor 5 Inc.'s president Julian Egbrecht laid off all of their remaining workforce without pay. It was seemingly the end of the company and all of their respective projects. Or was it? In the weeks before closure, it had become clear to their management that bankruptcy was all but inevitable. They therefore hatched a contingency plan to allow some of their games to live on. Kept secret from most of their employees, they would form a spiritual successor to survive Factor 5. Its name was Blue Harvest, a knowing wink towards the fake working title of Return of the Jedi used to hide its production. Blue Harvest was registered on December 9th, 2008, 10 days before Factor 5 Inc.'s closure. It was owned by Julian Egbrecht's partner, Katja Reitermeyer. The day-to-day running of the company was handled largely by the same people as Factor 5, but it was put under Reitermeyer's name to avoid credit issues. 2 days after it was set up, Egbrecht sold Factor 5's assets to Blue Harvest, including all of their intellectual property like unfinished games. In January 2009, Blue Harvest was renamed to White Harvest and opened for business less than 9 miles away from the offices of its predecessor. It was made up of developers previously employed by Factor 5 Inc. and continued some of their projects where they left off, including the Rogue Squadron Wii trilogy. Not everyone was invited to join White Harvest, however. Many ex-Factor 5 staffers were left in the dark about its existence, leading to an uproar which would ultimately tear the new enterprise apart. In January 2009, the former members of Factor 5 began to discover the truth. White Harvest was essentially resuming the work of Factor 5 with many of the same people as before, under a new name. They had worked almost 2 months unpaid before abruptly being let go as the company collapsed without proper notice under Californian state law. Julian Egbrecht had told them that they were unable to pay them for their weeks of work because LucasArts had first claimed to any of their remaining money as per a loan agreement signed in 2004. Yet, they had been able to fund a whole new company. People were starting to question how. White Harvest was open between January until the end of July in 2009. It was in this space of time that Green Harvest, now officially titled Star Wars Rogue Squadron Wii Rogue Leaders, was finally finished. However, what had also happened along the way was 2 major lawsuits being filed against the founders of Factor 5, which heavily involved White Harvest. The aforementioned unpaid former workers sued them for a variety of alleged violations. Not only did they want to claim their unpaid wages, they were suing for such reasons as improper notice before termination, and most damningly of all, fraud. They alleged that Factor 5 had fraudulently transferred its assets to White Harvest to avoid paying creditors. The lawsuits would drag out for years to come, and in the middle of it was LucasArts, the publisher of Star Wars Rogue Leaders Wii. They were left with a completed game on their hands, and yet they would decide against releasing it. LucasArts had been complicit in the operations of White Harvest, helping fund them despite full knowledge that lawsuits from former employees were likely. If the court cases surrounding the game ended badly for the founders of Factor 5, it had the potential to threaten the public images of both developer and publisher. From the perspective of LucasArts, Rogue Squadron Wii could have been caught in a hurricane of bad PR. It was for this reason that one very risk-averse publisher left the game unreleased, keeping the spotlight away from the delicate legal situation. White Harvest's other projects failed, and without any revenue from the sales of Star Wars, like Factor 5 before it, it was forced to close. The lawsuits against the former heads of Factor 5 would last over 7 years, the last finally being resolved in 2015. All of the unpaid developers were reimbursed for their ordeal. The accusations of fraud, on the other hand, were ultimately dismissed. During the span of the main court battle, the generation of the Wii passed, ending any remaining hope that LucasArts would allow Rogue Leaders Wii to come out in its original form. The only copies of the game known to exist are now among the former management of Factor 5 and White Harvest, as well as in the LucasArts archives, which are now owned by Disney. If you've enjoyed this video, please don't forget to subscribe and check out my other videos for many more lost games just like this one. You can hit the annotations to discover the cancelled sequel to Cell Damage, or an open world Daredevil game. You can visit Unseen64 at Unseen64.net. I've been Liam, I hope you've enjoyed this video, and have fun.